The word hit Nellie Harper like a fist to the chest. Leave. Walter McCrae stood in her doorway with his hat in his hands and dust on his boots and something desperate in his dark eyes, and he said it again, quieter this time, as though the quietness might make it easier to swallow. Nellie, you have to leave. Everyone else is already gone. She was standing at her kitchen table with her hands braced on the wood and her chin lifted and her jaw set in that way she had, and she did not move. Behind her, through the single cracked window, the sky was the color of a wound, that burnt, bloodless orange that the Texas Panhandle wore in the summer of 1887 like a bad reputation. The creek bed had gone dry 3 weeks ago. The soil crumbled to powder under a boot heel. The neighbors to the east, the Pendleton family, had loaded their wagon and driven north on a Tuesday and had not looked back once. Old Harlan Dubbs had nailed boards over his storefront windows in town and followed them 2 days later. The preacher had left on a Friday, which Nellie had privately considered the most ominous sign of all. And now here was Walter McCrae, foreman of the Double Bar C Ranch 2 miles down the road, standing in her doorway with that expression. She was starting to recognize the one where his concern for her was doing battle with his admiration for her, and neither of them was winning cleanly. "I am not leaving," she said. "Nellie, I am not leaving this land." Her voice did not shake. It was remarkable, really, how steady she kept it, because inside her something was shaking badly, not with fear, not entirely, but with the terrible weight of what she was choosing. "My father broke this ground. My mother is buried at the back of that field. This is Harper land, and it will be Harper land when the rain comes back, and it will come back, Walter. Water always comes back." He stepped inside without being invited. She did not stop him. He set his hat on the table between them and ran a hand through his dark hair and looked at her with those eyes of his, brown and honest and right now tormented, and he said, "The water may come back. That is true, but you could die waiting for it." She looked at him for a long moment. The silence between them was not empty. It was full of something that neither of them had named yet. Something that had been building since the first week of June, when he had ridden over to help her repair her fencing, and had stayed for supper, and they had talked until the stars came out, and then talked some more until the stars began to move. Something that had grown heavier and more present with every subsequent visit. Every morning she looked up from her work and saw his horse coming down the road. Every evening he lingered a little longer than a foreman with duties elsewhere had any reason to linger. "I know the risk," she said. "I am choosing to take it." He picked up his hat. He turned it in his hands. He looked at the floor, at the window, at the door, at everything but her, and then finally he looked at her directly and said, in a voice that was so quiet and so unguarded that it stunned her, "Then I am not leaving either." She had not expected that. She had expected argument. She had expected persuasion, or perhaps frustration, or even anger. She had not expected this man with his hands that were rough from real work and his eyes that were soft with something she was afraid to name, planting himself in her kitchen like he intended to take root in it. "Walter, you heard me," he said, and he put his hat back on his head. "I will be back in the morning. We need to talk about the water situation. There is a dry creek bed on the north edge of my land that runs underground for about a 1/4 mile, and I have been thinking about it." He was gone before she could find the right words. She stood in the quiet of her kitchen listening to his horse's hooves fade down the road, and she put her hands flat on the table again and breathed. Outside, the Texas sky burned its terrible orange. She did not leave, and neither did he. And what happened between them in the months that followed was the kind of story that the people of that county told for decades afterward, not because it was exceptional in any single dramatic way, but because it was true in all the ways that the truly great stories are built out of hard choices and hard work, and the slow, impossible miracle of 2 people deciding that the land beneath their feet and the person beside them were both worth staying for. But to understand it properly, you had to go back to the beginning. You had to go back to April. Nellie Harper had arrived in Hartwell County, Texas in the spring of 1885, At the age of 24, on the back of a wagon seat beside her father, Thomas Harper, who had spent the better part of 3 years convincing her mother, Ruth, that the Texas Panhandle was the future, and that a man with nerve and a strong back could build something real out there. Ruth Harper had agreed, finally, in the way that a woman agrees to something she has reservations about but loves the person proposing it too much to hold back. With her eyes open and her chin up, and her heart committed even while her mind kept a private tally of the risks. They had come from Missouri, from a farming family with a good reputation but thin soil that had gotten thinner every season. Thomas had sold everything that could be sold and loaded the rest, and driven his family southwest through weather that was sometimes beautiful and sometimes brutal and always surprising. Nellie had sat beside him on that wagon seat and watched the landscape change around her, the trees thinning out, the sky growing larger, the horizon opening up into something so vast and so empty that it felt, at first, like a kind of threat. But it did not stay feeling like a threat. That was what surprised her. By the time they crossed into the Panhandle, and Thomas had pointed at the flat, dry, enormous stretch of grassland that was their claim, something in Nellie had responded to it. Some deep and stubborn part of her that recognized in this wide, empty country something that matched a wide, empty part of herself. The part that had always wanted more room than the settled world seemed willing to give a woman. They had built their house themselves. Thomas and Nellie had put up the walls while Ruth managed the cooking and the supplies. And then all three of them had wrestled the roof into place on a day so hot that the sweat dried on your skin before it could drip. They had drilled a well and found water at 40 feet. Good water, cold and clean. And Thomas had laughed out loud with relief, and Nellie had sat on the edge of the well platform and dangled her feet and felt something she could only describe as home. Ruth Harper had died in the winter of 1886, 3 seasons after they arrived. A lung sickness that came on in November and deepened through December and took her in the gray first week of January. The county doctor had come and done what he could, which was not enough. Thomas had sat beside her bed for 4 days without sleeping, and when she was gone he had gone quiet in a way that did not entirely lift. He kept working. He kept the land going. But something in him had gone still. Thomas Harper had followed his wife in October of 1886, 11 months after she died. His heart had simply stopped one morning while he was in the field, and Nellie had found him there in the turned dirt with his face turned toward the sky and his expression. She had always thought, not entirely unhappy, as though he had been in the middle of checking the quality of the soil and had been interrupted by something he considered a reasonable interruption. She had buried him beside Ruth at the back of the field and had stood at the graves for a long time, and then had gone inside and made herself supper, and sat at the table her father had built with his own hands, and decided that she was not going to leave this place. It was that simple and that complicated, all at once. The decision did not feel like courage from the inside. It felt like the only available option for someone who was who she was. She had managed the farm alone through the winter and into the spring of 1887, and the spring had been beautiful, deceptive. She would later understand, the way beautiful things in the Panhandle sometimes are. The grass was green and the creek ran well and the well was full, and Nellie had planted her kitchen garden and her grain field with the organized hope of someone who has been paying attention. Then May came in dry. Then June came in drier. The creek slowed. The grass yellowed. The sky turned that particular shade of blue that looks, in retrospect, less like health and more like a held breath. By the beginning of July, everyone in the county knew what was coming. The old-timers said the last drought like this had been in 1879, and it had lasted 2 years and broken 3 families and 1 man's mind. The families who had come more recently and had less built into the land than they had invested in hope began making their plans quietly. That was when Walter McCrae came into Nellie's story properly. He had been there at the edges of it for a while. She had met him the previous autumn at the county gathering where Thomas was still alive, and Walter had been introduced as the new foreman of the Double Bar C, which was owned by a cattle rancher named Clement Baird, who spent most of his time in Fort Worth and left the actual management of his land to hired men. Walter was 28 years old and had come to Texas from New Mexico, where he had worked cattle since he was 15. He was not the tallest man in the room or the most talkative, but he had a quality of stillness about him that Nellie noticed, a sense that when he was present, he was entirely present, not calculating his next sentence or measuring his audience or performing anything for anyone. They had spoken briefly at that gathering, pleasantries about the weather and the land, and then Thomas had pulled her away to speak with the county commissioner about something, and that had been that. But after Thomas died and Nellie was running the farm alone, Walter had appeared one morning in the first week of June with a length of fence wire over his shoulder and offered to help repair the section of fencing her cattle had broken through the previous week. She had almost said no. She was proud, genuinely proud, and she had learned early that accepting help from people gave them an opinion about what you should do with your life, and she had enough opinions already from people who had not earned the right to them. She said yes, though, because the fence genuinely needed fixing, and she had 6 other things that also needed fixing, and she was one person. He worked without talking too much, which she respected. He did not offer advice she hadn't asked for. He did not treat the work as a favor he was doing her, but as a task that needed to be done, and the distinction mattered to her more than she could have explained. When they finished, he had accepted a cup of coffee on the porch, and they had talked about cattle and soil and the creek levels, and whether the dry weather would hold, and she had noticed that he asked her opinion on things and actually listened to the answer. He had come back the following week to help with a second section of fencing, and the week after that to look at her well pump, which had been making a sound she did not trust. And somewhere in there, the visits had stopped being about specific tasks and had become simply about coming, and she had stopped pretending even to herself that she looked forward to Tuesday mornings for any reason other than the sound of his horse on the road. It was not simple, of course. Nothing honest is. She was a 26-year-old woman, running a farm alone on the edge of a drought, with a pride so strong it occasionally made her own life harder than it needed to be. He was a man who worked for someone else's ranch and had his own uncertainties, his own hidden weight that she could see in his eyes sometimes, but had not yet been invited to understand. They circled each other with a caution that was part instinct and part deliberate, both of them old enough to know that the wrong step at the wrong moment could poison a thing that deserved better. Then the drought deepened and the neighbors began to leave, and that evening in mid-July came when Walter stood in her doorway with his hat in his hands and said leave, and she said no, and he said he was not leaving either, and everything changed. He came back the next morning as he had promised. She had coffee ready, which she told herself was just good manners. He tied his horse at the post and came onto the porch and sat on the bench she had made from 2 boards and a pair of fence posts, which had seemed entirely sufficient for a bench, and he pulled a folded piece of paper from his shirt pocket and spread it on his knee. It was a hand-drawn map of the surrounding land. She could see her property outlined in pencil and his property to the south, and the courses of the 2 creek beds, and then a dotted line that ran underground, labeled in his neat handwriting with the words possible subterranean flow. "I have been reading about this," he said without preamble. "There are rivers underground here. The whole Panhandle sits above an aquifer that is water stored in rock deep down, hundreds of feet in some places but in other spots closer. There are formations where water runs underground between rock layers and comes closer to the surface. I think that is what this is." He traced the dotted line with his finger. "This was a creek 10 years ago, according to the old survey. It dried up, but the water did not disappear. It went down." Nellie bent over the map. She could smell the heat coming off him and the leather of his belt and the clean, particular smell of someone who had been outdoors, and she made herself focus on the map. "You think we could dig a well along this line," she said. "Not just a well, a series of test holes to find out how deep the water is and where the flow is strongest. If we find it, we could potentially get enough water for your cattle and your kitchen garden through the worst of the drought." She straightened up and looked at him. "That is a significant amount of digging." "It is," he said. He met her eyes steadily. "I am not afraid of digging." She looked at him for a long moment and felt that thing again, that frightening, clarifying thing that had been growing in her chest since June. She pushed it back with the firm hand of someone who had learned that emotions and practicality needed to keep their own lanes or both of them suffered. "When do we start?" she said. They started the following morning. What came next was the strangest and most exhausting and quietly most alive period of Nellie Harper's life. They rose before dawn and worked until the heat became impossible, and then rested through the midday and worked again into the evening. The ground was hard as iron from the drought, and every foot of depth was a negotiation. Walter had borrowed a post-hole digger from the Double Bar C's equipment shed, and they took turns with it. And when the hole was too deep for the digger, they switched to a hand auger, and when the auger needed 2 people to turn it, they turned it together, standing close with their hands on the bar between them and the rhythm of it becoming its own strange intimacy. They found the first water at 22 feet on the 3rd day. It was not a gush. It was a seep, a slow darkening of the soil at the bottom of the test hole that built over the course of an afternoon into a shallow pool that was undeniably wet and undeniably present. They both stood at the edge of the hole and looked down at it, and Walter said nothing for a full minute, which Nellie understood was the equivalent of a shout from a quieter man. "We need to case this and dig 2 more test holes along the line," he said finally. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "You are smiling. I am not." "You absolutely are." She looked away to hide it. "Get the casing." He laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh freely and unguarded, and it did something permanent to her, that laugh, something she could not undo. They cased the first hole and dug 2 more along the underground line, and the second one came in at 18 feet with notably better flow, and the third at 20 feet. And by the end of the second week, they had a functioning water source that, while not abundant, was reliable and appeared to be genuinely fed by the underground formation Walter had theorized. They built a rough pump mechanism over the best well, and Walter rode into the nearest town, a place called Cartwright that was 20 miles east and had managed to keep its hardware store open through the drought, and he came back with a proper cast iron hand pump and the bolts and brackets to mount it. The day he installed the pump and they worked the handle and actual water came up and out in a clear, steady stream. Nellie put her hands under it and let it run over her fingers, and she thought about her father, who had drilled the first well on this property, and laughed with relief. And she felt him very close and very present, and she cried a little, turning her face away so Walter would not see. He saw. He did not make a thing of it. He just set down the wrench he was holding and waited. And when she wiped her face on her sleeve and turned back, he simply handed her the wrench and said, 2 more brackets on the left side. She took the wrench and said, "I know," and they finished mounting the pump. It was in August that she learned about Walter's hidden weight. He came on a Tuesday morning the way he always did, but he was different that day, not his usual self, which was steady and present and engaged. He was somewhere else behind his eyes in a way she had learned to recognize as meaning something had happened, something he was working through. She gave him coffee and waited. He was not a man you rushed. She had learned that the way you learn anything about a person worth knowing, by paying careful attention over time. He sat on the porch bench and held the cup and looked out at the dried grassland and the pale sky, and eventually he said, "I had a letter from New Mexico." She waited. "My brother Owen," he said. "He is in some trouble with a man named Cassidy, not the famous one, a different one, a land grabber. Owen has a small cattle operation, and Cassidy has been trying to force him off the land for 2 years, and now he is using legal pressure, filing claims on Owen's water rights through a lawyer in Santa Fe." He stopped, Owen wants me to come. The thing inside Nellie's chest did something it had no permission to do. It tightened. Is there something you can do? She said. Her voice was entirely controlled. I know people in Santa Fe, a lawyer I worked for briefly who is honest, and I know Cassidy's operation well enough to know there is a weak point in his legal argument. He filed on water rights that were already registered in Owen's name back in 1882, and someone in the county office either made an error or was paid to. He turned the cup in his hands. If I go I could fix this, I think, but it means leaving. How long? 2 months. Maybe 3. She looked at her hands. She looked at the new pump mounted over the well, which was still producing water, slowly and reliably, from 20 feet down. She looked at the dried grass and the pale sky and thought about 2 months or 3 with no one coming down the road on Tuesday morning. You should go, she said. Nellie, he is your brother. She looked at him. You should go. He looked at her for a long time with those honest brown eyes. There is something I need to say before I go, he said, and I want to say it plainly because I am not good at saying things sideways. Her heart did something it had no business doing. I know what this is, he said. What has been happening here between us all summer. I'm not confused about it, and I do not think you are. And I want to say it out loud before I leave so that it is said, so that it is real and not just a thing we have been dancing around for 4 months. Walter, I am in love with you, he said, simply, directly, without any decoration, the way he did everything. I am completely in love with you, and I have been since about the middle of June, and I am going to New Mexico to fix my brother's trouble, and then I am coming back, if you want me to come back. The silence that followed was enormous. Nellie Harper was not a woman who flustered easily. She had been managing her own life and her own heart for 2 years on a farm in a drought, and she had developed something that looked, from the outside, like imperviousness. But this man with his steady eyes and his honest words and his complete absence of performance had said the truest and most wanted thing she had heard in longer than she could account for, and her careful control was not equal to it. Come back, she said. And then, because she was who she was and the words were there and honest, I will be here. I am not going anywhere. Something moved through his face, a softening, a warmth, a relief. He stood up. He set down the coffee cup. He crossed the 2 steps between them, and he took her hand and he held it for a moment with both of his, looking at her, and then he bent and pressed his lips to her knuckles in a gesture so formal and so tender that it made her eyes sting. I will be back before the first cold weather, he said. See that you are, she said. He rode away down the road. She stood on the porch and watched until she could not see him any more, and then she went inside and sat at the kitchen table and pressed her hand flat against her chest as though she could hold the feeling in, as though it might escape if she was not careful. Outside, the sky was still dry and burning, but the well was full. He had been gone for 10 days when the man named Doyle showed up. His full name was Curtis Doyle, and he came from Fort Worth representing what he called an investment consortium, and what he actually was, as Nellie understood within 15 minutes of his arrival, was a land speculator. He was in his 40s with a neat mustache, and a suit that cost more than most people in the county had spent on building materials, and he rode up in a small buggy with a driver and asked to speak with the property owner. Nellie came to the door with flour on her apron because she had been baking, and she said she was the property owner, and he looked at her with precisely the expression she had spent her whole adult life being prepared to correct. Ma'am, he said, I was told the Harper land was owned by Thomas Harper. Thomas Harper was my father, she said. He passed in October of last year. I am his heir. The deed is in my name. I have the papers. He adjusted his expression not enough. Of course, of course. I wonder if you would have a moment. What do you want, Mr. Doyle? He wanted to buy the land. He dressed it up in several layers of business language and made reference to investment opportunities and development potential and the hard realities of the current drought. But stripped of all that, what he wanted was to give her a price that was significantly below the land's actual value and take it off her hands. Because he and his associates were buying up distressed properties throughout the Panhandle with the intention of holding them until the drought broke and then selling them at a profit to cattle operations looking to expand. Nellie listened to him the whole way through. She did not interrupt. She let him finish completely, and then she said, "No." He blinked. "Ma'am, I don't think you appreciate the position." "I appreciate it exactly," she said. "I am not selling. This is not a distressed property. It has a functioning water source and productive soil, and I intend to farm it." "Good day, Mr. Doyle." He tried again. He pivoted to sympathy, and then to reason, and then to a kind of gentle condescension that suggested she did not fully understand what she was getting herself into. All alone out here, all by herself. A woman with no family support and no help, and the drought not even half done yet. Each pivot found her exactly where she had been at the start, polite, immovable, and very clearly not going to change her mind. He left eventually, unsatisfied, with a parting remark about the offer remaining open if she changed her mind. She went back inside and picked up her baking and thought about Walter, and about the land, and about the particular kind of trap that men like Doyle had been springing on women and on poor people, and on anyone without the legal backing or the social position to resist. And she felt the familiar deep anger that lived in her chest alongside the love and the stubbornness and the grief. The injustice of it was not subtle. You worked a piece of ground, you made something of it, and then when hardship hit, someone arrived with money and patience and waited for you to become desperate enough to take less than you deserved. The whole mechanism was designed for the vulnerability of the desperate. She was not going to be desperate. She refused it. Doyle came back a week later. This time with a different approach. He had spoken to the county assessor, he said, and it appeared there was a question about the transfer of the deed from Thomas Harper to Nellie Harper, specifically regarding whether the proper procedures had been followed for a transfer to a female heir without a husband. The cold that went through her then was not fear. It was something harder and more focused than fear. She sent a letter to Walter that day. She outlined the situation clearly and without emotion and asked if his Santa Fe lawyer knew anyone in Fort Worth or could point her toward the right resources. She sent the letter by way of the general store in Cartwright, which was still receiving and sending mail, and she went back to her farm and kept working. 3 days later, before Walter could possibly have received her letter and responded, something unexpected happened. The postmistress in Cartwright, a woman named Agnes Pryor, who had been in the county longer than almost anyone, and who had a network of acquaintances that would have impressed a general, sent word that she had heard about Doyle and his deeds question tactic, and that she knew a woman in Amarillo, a lawyer's widow who had learned her late husband's business thoroughly, and ran his office for the year after his death, until the state refused to give her the license she had earned, who now worked as a legal researcher and document preparer for various attorneys in the area, and who would be willing to look at Nellie's situation for a fair fee. Nellie rode to Cartwright and sent a wire to Amarillo, and 3 days after that received a wire back saying that her deed was in fact properly executed and recorded, that the transfer to her as sole heir was legally sound under Texas law, and that any assessor claiming otherwise was either confused or in someone's pocket. The researcher, whose name was Eleanor Voss, offered to write the formal response letter for a fee of $12, and Nellie said yes immediately, which used nearly all of her remaining cash but was entirely worth it. The response letter was sent to Doyle through the county assessor's office in mid-August, and Doyle did not come back after that. Nellie stood in her kitchen the evening she received confirmation of the letter's delivery, and felt the particular exhausted triumph of having won a fight that should not have needed to be fought. She let herself feel it for a full minute, the satisfaction of it and the anger underneath it, and then she put it away and went back to work. She wrote to Walter about it, not the desperate version of the letter she had sent earlier, but a complete account of what had happened and how she had resolved it, because she had decided while he was away that honesty was the whole point of whatever they were to each other, and that meant sharing the full story rather than just the polished version. His letter back came in the third week of August. It was 4 pages long in his neat, careful handwriting, and it was the most personal thing he had ever sent her. He told her that the situation in New Mexico was progressing, that he had found the error in Cassidy's filing and was working with his Santa Fe lawyer contact to challenge it properly. He told her that Owen was holding on and was grateful. He told her that she had handled the Doyle situation exactly as he would have hoped and better than most people, man or woman, would have managed. He told her that the county of Hartwell did not fully appreciate what it had in her. And then near the bottom of the third page, in handwriting that was slightly less neat than the rest, as though it had been written faster or with more feeling, he wrote, "I think about you every single morning. I think about that pump and the water coming up and the look on your face. I think about your kitchen and your coffee and the way you say, 'I know,' when you already understand something before I finish explaining it. I have never missed a place the way I miss your porch." She read those lines 4 times. Then she put the letter in the tin box where she kept important papers, next to the deed and her parents' marriage certificate, and she went about her day with something quiet and warm sitting in the center of her chest. September arrived and the drought did not break, but something in the land shifted. The temperatures dropped, not dramatically but enough, from the brutal high summer heat to something that was merely very hot, and the cattle that she had kept alive through careful management of the well water began to look less strained. She had sold 3 head in late August to a cattle buyer passing through, which she had hated but which had reduced the load on her water resources to something she could sustain. She had 6 head left and they were healthy and her well was holding. She had also planted a small late-season kitchen garden using careful water rationing, and it was producing, not abundantly, but enough. Dried beans and squash and some root vegetables, and enough to get through the autumn if she was careful. The town of Cartwright was quieter than it had been. Several businesses were still closed, but not everything. The hardware store was open. The general store was open. Agnes Pryor at the post office was open always, because Agnes Pryor was constitutionally incapable of closing. Nellie rode into town every 2 weeks for supplies and mail, and she had conversations with the few people who remained. And she understood from those conversations that she had become a kind of reference point. People talked about Nellie Harper who had stayed, who had found water, who had beaten the land speculator. She was not entirely comfortable with this. She did not feel like a symbol. She felt like a person who had made the only decision she could have made and had been lucky enough to have the skills and the resources to back it up. And she was aware that luck was as much a part of the story as bravery, and she did not want credit for luck. But she did not say that to people because it would have sounded like false modesty, which was as dishonest as regular pride. Walter came back the first week of October. She was at the pump when she heard the horse and looked up, and there he was, coming down the road in the golden October light with his hat pushed back on his head, and the particular posture of someone who had been riding for several days and was deeply ready to stop riding. She did not run. She was not the kind of person who ran. She set down the bucket she had been filling, which took her a full 5 deliberate seconds that used every piece of self-discipline she owned, and then she walked across the yard to the gate. He pulled up. He looked down at her from the horse with his brown eyes and his travel-worn face, and a look on him like something that had been wound tight for weeks was slowly unwinding. "Water is still coming up," he said, looking at the pump. "It never stopped," she said. He swung down from the horse. He was taller than she always expected, standing close. She remembered this from before, and it always surprised her again. He stood in front of her and looked at her for a moment, and then he put his arms around her and pulled her against him and held her there, not dramatically but solidly, the way you hold something you were not sure would be there when you got back and you are enormously relieved to find it is. She held him back. She pressed her face against the dusty shoulder of his coat and felt his arms around her and breathed. "Owen," she said, into his coat. "Safe. The filing was thrown out. Cassidy is backing off." His voice was close to her ear. "Are you all right? The letter about Doyle handled," she said. He pulled back enough to look at her face. "I know, you told me. I just wanted to check." "I am all right," she said. "I am much better now." He smiled at that. She had not realized until that moment how much she had missed his smile. He stayed for supper and they sat at her father's table, and she had made a proper meal from what she had: roast beef from the one head she had recently butchered, root vegetables from the garden, biscuits that had turned out well. He ate with the focused appreciation of someone who had been eating trail food for 2 months, and she watched him and felt quietly pleased, which was a feeling she was still getting used to allowing herself. After supper they sat on the porch in the October dark, and he told her everything about New Mexico, about Owen and his little spread outside of Las Cruces, and the lawyer in Santa Fe who had turned out to be exactly as capable as Walter had hoped, and the moment in the county clerk's office in Doña Ana when the counterfiling had been accepted, and the legal challenge officially lodged, and Walter had known it was going to be all right. "Cassidy is not a good man," Walter said. "He has been doing this to small landowners for years, native families who have been there generations, Mexican families with old land grants. He finds a pressure point and he applies it. He has enough money to make the legal process work for him, and he knows most people cannot hold on long enough to fight back. It is the same mechanism as Doyle," Nellie said. "Find the vulnerability and apply pressure until the person breaks." "Yes," he looked at her. "You understand that very well." "I have been thinking about it all summer," she said, "about how it works and why it works. It works because people are isolated. If the Pendletons had not left, if there had been more people staying, Doyle would have had a harder time. There is a kind of protection in community that we lost here when everyone scattered." Walter was quiet for a moment. "You have been thinking about more than just surviving," he said. "I have been thinking about what comes after," she said. "When the drought breaks, what this county could be if the people who stayed, who were always here, who know this land, had some way to support each other the way Doyle's investors support him." She had not said this aloud before. It had been living in her head for weeks, taking shape in the long, quiet hours of well-watching and cattle tending and night sky looking. Walter listened to it with his full, still attention, the way he always listened, and she found that saying it out loud to him made it more real and more possible than it had been inside her own head. "Tell me more," he said. She did. She told him about the idea she had been forming, a kind of cooperative arrangement among the small landowners who had remained, where they shared resources and information and purchasing power, so that individually they were less vulnerable and collectively they had the kind of leverage that kept people like Doyle at bay. She had read about similar arrangements in agricultural journals that she borrowed from the Cartwright General Store, and she thought there was a real model there that could work for the Panhandle specifically. He listened to all of it and then said, "I want to help with this." She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean I want to be involved in building it." He looked at her steadily. "And I mean that I want to be here, not just as a foreman for Clement Baird who happens to ride over on Tuesdays. I want to be here properly." He paused. "I have been thinking about this the whole 2 months in New Mexico, about what I want and what I am doing and what kind of life I am building." She held herself very still. "I think Clement Baird will sell me 20 acres of the Double Bar C's south corner," he said. "He has been talking about reducing his Texas holdings and consolidating in Fort Worth. 20 acres is enough for a small cattle operation of my own, managed alongside your land. If you were willing to." He stopped. He took a breath. He was, she realized, nervous. This steady, self-contained man was genuinely nervous. "Nellie, I would like to ask you to marry me." The October night was very quiet around them. The stars were the enormous Panhandle stars, more of them than any sky had a right to contain. She had known it was coming in some form. She had known it since August. She had been, in the privacy of her own heart, entirely certain of her answer, since approximately the moment he had ridden up that afternoon in the October light. But she took a moment with it anyway, because this was the largest thing anyone had ever asked her, and it deserved a moment. "Yes," she said. He let out a breath. He reached over and took her hand in the dark. She let him hold it, and she held his back, and they sat on the porch of her father's house looking at the dry land and the enormous stars, and she felt something in her chest settle into a new position, a richer and more complete position than any she had occupied before. "When?" she said. "When would you like?" "Before the winter gets serious," she said. "I do not want a long engagement. I have never seen the point of them." He laughed, and there was relief in it and happiness and a warmth that she felt in her own chest like something radiating. "Agnes Pryor will probably want to organize something large," he said. "Agnes Pryor can organize whatever she likes as long as she does it quickly." He laughed again. She smiled in the dark. They married in November of 1887, on a clear cold day with a sky so blue it almost hurt, in the Cartwright church that had been closed since the preacher left, and had been opened specifically for the occasion. Agnes Pryor had indeed organized something, and it was not small. She had sent word to every family still in the county, and to a number who had left but were near enough to return for a day, and the church was as full as it had been in its best days, which Nellie had not expected, and which moved her in a way she had not been prepared for. The ceremony was performed by a traveling circuit preacher named Reverend Mathers, who came through Cartwright 4 times a year, and who had the weathered, practical manner of a man who had performed a great many sacraments in difficult circumstances, and had concluded that the spirit of a thing mattered more than its ceremony. He married them in 15 minutes flat with a directness that both Nellie and Walter privately appreciated. Nellie wore her mother's dress, which she had spent 3 evenings altering to fit her own proportions, taking in the waist and letting out the shoulders, and when she stood in front of the piece of mirror she kept in the bedroom and looked at herself in it, she looked like herself and like her mother at the same time, which was exactly right. Walter wore a dark suit that she had not seen before and had presumably acquired in New Mexico or Santa Fe, and he looked, standing at the front of the church waiting for her, like exactly the man she was walking towards, serious and warm and real and worth the whole walk. The ring he had brought was a simple band of silver, not elaborate but solid and well-made, and when he put it on her finger she felt the weight of it as the right weight, not too light to notice, not so heavy it was a burden. Agnes Pryor had organized a dinner afterward in the general store, which had been cleared and set with tables, and there was more food than Nellie would have expected from a drought-stricken county, which spoke to the way people pull together when a thing matters to them. There was dancing to a fiddle player named Carl Munoz who could make a fiddle say almost anything, and the evening went on longer than it had any practical reason to, and was warm in spite of the November cold outside, and Nellie danced with Walter twice, once in the stiff, formal way of people in front of an audience, and once, late in the evening, in the easy, close way of people who are no longer performing anything for anyone. They rode home together in the dark with a blanket over their laps against the cold and the stars overhead, and the land around them quiet and dry and present. She put her head on his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and the horse knew the way. That winter was the beginning of their proper life together. He had negotiated the 20 acres from Clement Baird by December, at a fair price that had taken some weeks to settle, but that Walter had been patient and precise about, and the 2 properties were now effectively adjoining. He moved his belongings from the double Bar C bunkhouse to the Harper farmhouse, which was what they both kept calling it for a long time before either of them thought to call it anything else. There was a period of adjustment, not difficult exactly, but real. 2 people who had lived alone for years and had developed their own rhythms learning to share a space, a kitchen, a day. What she discovered was that he was easy to live within the specific ways that were hardest to predict and hard to find. He was not fussy about his comfort. He was genuinely helpful without being performative about it. He did not offer opinions on how she managed her kitchen or her garden or her cattle. He made his own coffee in the morning without waking her and left a cup for her on the stove, which was a small thing but not small at all. He read in the evenings, which she also did, and they had discovered an overlapping interest in farming science and agricultural journals that led to some of the best conversations of her adult life. He was also, she discovered, a man with nightmares from a dark past that he had not yet fully told her. She woke on a night in December to find him sitting on the edge of the bed, very still in the dark. She lay quietly for a moment, alert but not alarmed, and then she said, "Walter." He was quiet for a second and then said, "I woke you, I am sorry." "You did not. I was already awake." This was not true, but she felt it was the right thing to say, which made it true enough. "What is it?" He was quiet for longer this time. Long enough that she sat up and put her hand on his back and felt the tension in him, the particular held-breath quality of someone who has been carrying something too long. "New Mexico," he said finally. "Before Owen, before all of this," he stopped. "I was involved in something I am not proud of, not anything illegal, but I worked for a man who was not a good man, and I knew it, and I kept working for him because I needed the money, and I told myself the reasons were good enough." She waited. "He was a water rights consolidator. Before Cassidy, there were others. He was one of the first, out in New Mexico, buying up rights and using lawyers and pressure to force out small operators. And I worked his cattle." He paused. "I drove cattle over other people's fences. I did not know at first. I found out gradually, and then I knew, and I still stayed another season." "And then you left," she said. "And then I left," he said, "but not before I had been part of it." She sat with this for a moment. She was not going to be dishonest with him by pretending it was nothing. It was not nothing. He had been part of a system that did to people what Doyle had tried to do to her, and that mattered and deserved to be acknowledged. "Why are you telling me now?" she said. "Because you should know," he said. "Because you are my wife and this is my hidden past, and I am not interested in keeping hidden things from you." He turned to look at her in the dark. "And because watching you fight Doyle all summer, and knowing I had been on the other side of that fight once, it has been sitting in me badly." She looked at him for a long moment. His face in the dark was honest and ashamed and waiting, and she thought about who he was now, the man who had come to fix her fence and found her water and gone to New Mexico to protect his brother, and asked her to marry him with his hands almost shaking. She thought about who she was, which was someone who believed that a person was not only their worst chapter. "You left," she said. "You found out fully and you left, and you have spent years since then doing the opposite. Building things instead of taking them." She paused. "That matters. It does not undo what I did. No, nothing undoes what we did, but it tells us who we are becoming." She took his hand. "Go to sleep, Walter." He lay back down. She lay down beside him. After a while his breathing evened out. She lay awake for another hour, not with worry but with the full feeling of knowing someone, the intimacy of being trusted with the worst of a person, and finding that it did not change the fundamental truth of them. It was, she thought, the real moment of marriage, not the ceremony. The drought broke in February of 1888. It broke the way those things sometimes do, not with a gradual easing but with a sudden, total commitment. A storm system came in from the northwest over 3 days and delivered more rain in 72 hours than the county had seen in the previous 14 months combined. The creek beds filled. The dry grass, which was not truly dead, just dormant, waiting, began to show green within 4 days. The land did not so much recover as reveal that it had been there all along, preserved under the difficulty, patient. Nellie stood in the rain on the second day of the storm and let it soak her completely, and felt like someone who had been holding their breath for 8 months and had finally been permitted to exhale. Walter came and stood beside her and got equally soaked, and neither of them spoke for a while. "You knew it would come back," he said. "I knew water always comes back," she said. "I did not know when. You stayed anyway." "There was nowhere else to go," she said, and then thought about it and corrected herself. "That is not entirely true. There were places I could have gone. I stayed because I chose to." He put his arm around her wet shoulders. "I have been telling people all autumn that you are the bravest person on the whole plain," he said. She looked at him. "Agnes Pryor asked me once how you did it, staying through all of it alone," he said. "I told her I thought you were probably the bravest person on the whole plain." She agreed. Nellie looked back at the rain falling on the creek bed that was filling with water. "I am not brave," she said. "Brave suggests I was not afraid. I was afraid the entire time." "That is what makes it brave," he said. She did not have a response to that. She stood in the rain with his arm around her and watched the water come back and felt the full, complicated weight of all of it. The loss and the grief and the drought and the fight and the love and the choice, and let herself feel that she had done something real. That this ground was still hers and that she had held it, and that it was worth holding. The spring of 1888 was extraordinary. The Panhandle grass came in green and thick, fed by months of saved-up underground water and released by the February rains, and the whole landscape transformed in a matter of weeks from the devastated pale brown of the drought into something almost lush. Wildflowers appeared that Nellie had not seen before: blue bonnets and red Indian paintbrush, and a small yellow flower she could not identify that carpeted the north pasture in a way that seemed almost impossible from the bare ground of 6 months before. 2 families who had left the county during the drought came back. The Pendletons, who had gone north, returned in March and found their house largely intact and their well still good. And Thomas Pendleton came by the Harper property, the McCrae Harper property, though they still mostly called it the Harper place, and stood on the porch and said to Nellie and Walter that he had heard from at least 4 people between here and the Kansas line that Nellie Harper had stayed through the drought and found water and held the land, and that it had made him feel like a coward the whole time he was gone. "You are not a coward," Nellie said. "You had your family to consider. You had yourself to consider," he said, "and you stayed." "I had Walter," she said. "Not until October," said Agnes Pryor, who had come with the Pendletons for some reason that was entirely consistent with Agnes Pryor's general approach to other people's lives. Nellie did not dignify this with a response. The cooperative idea that she had told Walter about on the October porch became, over the spring and summer of 1888, a real thing. It started small 4 families, sharing a grain purchase from an Amarillo supplier that gave them a better price than any of them could have gotten alone. Then it expanded to include a shared arrangement with the Cartwright hardware store for a discount on tools and equipment in exchange for an exclusive purchasing commitment. By the summer it had a name: the Hartwell County Growers Cooperative, and 14-member families, and a simple but functional charter that Walter had helped draft and Aliner Voss in Amarillo had reviewed and approved. It was not a perfect institution. There were arguments about resource allocation and about the terms of membership for families who had left during the drought and now wanted to join, and about whether the cooperative should take any position on political matters affecting farmers in the state legislature. The argument about returning families was the hardest one, and Nellie took a position on it that was not universally popular. She argued that the cooperative should be open to anyone who committed to the land going forward, regardless of what they had done during the drought. "Some people judge those who left," Walter said one evening after a particularly contentious meeting, sitting at the kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee in front of him. "Some people did not have the options I had," Nellie said. "I had a functioning well and no children and a very stubborn character. Not everyone had all 3 of those things." "You are a fair person," he said. "I try to be," she said. "It is harder than being unfair." He smiled at that. She liked it when he smiled at the kitchen table. It was a domestic and private smile, different from any other version of his smile, and it belonged to their kitchen and nowhere else. She discovered she was pregnant in the early summer of 1888. She had suspected it for about 2 weeks before she said anything, and she sat with it in that private way she had with large things, turning it over, getting used to its shape. When she finally told Walter, She chose a morning when they were both at the table before the day's work, and the light was coming through the east window and the coffee was good. She said, "I am going to have a baby." He went very still. That particular stillness that she had learned meant something large was happening inside him. When, he said, "December, I think, or January," he looked at his hands, he looked at the window, he looked at her. His face was doing several things at once and she let him work through them. "Are you well?" he said. "Are you feeling well?" "I feel fine," she said. "A little tired in the mornings, but otherwise entirely fine." He got up and came around the table and crouched down beside her chair and took both her hands in both of his. "Nellie," he said. "I know," she said. He pressed his forehead briefly against her hands. It was such an unguarded gesture from this contained, careful man that her throat tightened. "We are going to need a second bedroom," she said. He laughed against her hands. "Yes," he said. "We are." They built the second bedroom in July, an addition off the east side of the house, Walter doing most of the framing while Nellie mixed plaster and managed the material supply and made architectural suggestions that he incorporated into the design without comment, which she considered one of his best qualities. The room was finished by August with a proper window and a wood floor and plastered walls, and she stood in it one evening when it was done and thought about her parents and their bedroom, and about continuity, and about what it meant to build forward. Their son was born on January the 12th, 1889, in the farmhouse in a difficult labor that lasted 18 hours and tested every person in the room, which was Nellie and Walter and Mrs. Pendleton, who had experience with such things, and Agnes Pryor, who had no medical experience whatsoever but whose presence Nellie had specifically requested, because Agnes Pryor was constitutionally incapable of being dismayed by anything. The baby was large and healthy and deeply opinionated about announcing himself, and Walter, who had held himself together through all 18 hours with a control that Nellie privately thought was costing him significantly, came apart very quietly in the corner of the room when the baby cried for the first time, turning away from the room and pressing his hand over his eyes for a moment before he pulled himself back together. She saw it. She did not say anything until later when Mrs. Pendleton and Agnes Pryor had gone and it was just the two of them and the baby in the winter quiet house. "You cried," she said. "I did not," he said. "You absolutely did." "I had something in my eye," he said, both eyes simultaneously. She shifted the baby in her arms. He was asleep now, this large, healthy, opinionated baby with his father's dark hair and his mother's determined mouth. "What are we going to name him?" she said. They had not fully settled this. They had discussed it in the way of people who have time and then suddenly do not. "Thomas," he said, "if you agree." She looked at him. "Thomas Walter McCrae," she said. "If you want the Harper in there, Thomas Walter McCrae," she said again. "He knows where he comes from. He does not need it in his name." He came and sat beside her on the bed and looked at his son, and his face had that private, domestic quality that she loved, the one that belonged to their kitchen and their bedroom and nowhere else. "Hello, Thomas," he said, very quietly, and then more quietly still, "we are going to take such good care of you." Spring of 1889 brought another good rainfall and a strong growing season, and the Hartwell County Growers Cooperative had grown to 22-member families and was beginning to have real political weight in county affairs. Walter had been nominated by the member families to serve as their representative to the county commissioners, a role he had accepted with the reluctance of a man who does not enjoy being prominent, and the commitment of one who understands that not accepting important work because it is inconvenient is a form of selfishness. He was good at it. He was precise and honest in the meetings, and he did not make speeches but made arguments, and the distinction was noticed. The county commissioner, a man named Franklin Greer who had been in office for 8 years and had a flexible relationship with certain outside interests that the cooperative did not appreciate, found Walter McCrae to be an unusually difficult person to dismiss or manipulate, which became a point of some satisfaction around the Harper McCrae kitchen table. The cooperative also brought something that Nellie had not fully anticipated: friendships. Real ones, built out of shared work and shared interest rather than proximity or convenience. Elinor Voss in Amarillo became a genuine correspondent, and eventually, when she visited the county to assist with the cooperative's legal incorporation, a friend. There was a woman named Maria Domings whose family had farmed in the county for 2 generations and who had stayed through the drought with her elderly mother, and who brought a knowledge of the land's water patterns and soil behavior that went back decades, and that Nellie found invaluable and fascinating. There was a young man, barely 19, named Samuel Pryor, Agnes Pryor's nephew, who had come to work for his aunt's household and had turned out to have a genuine ability with crop rotation and soil amendment that he had been educating himself about through every agricultural publication he could get his hands on. The cooperative absorbed all of it and used all of it and was genuinely better for every person it contained. And Nellie sat at its meetings sometimes and felt a kind of deep, earned satisfaction that was different from the satisfaction of personal survival. It was the satisfaction of a system working, of people protected by something they had built together, of the vulnerability that people like Doyle and Cassidy exploited being substantially reduced by collective presence. She told Walter this one evening. He said, "You built this." "We built this," she said. "I helped," he said. "You started it. You had the idea and you kept it going through the 6 months when people were not sure it was going to work, and you were the one who brought in Maria and Samuel and who wrote to Elinor. You built it." She accepted this, not with false modesty or deflection, but with the genuine, clean acceptance of accurate credit. Thomas was walking by March of 1889, which Nellie considered either very early or entirely on schedule depending on which part of her was speaking, and he was into everything with a thoroughness that seemed deliberately calculated to test his parents' combined resources. He was a serious child who laughed suddenly and often, and who had already developed very strong opinions about which objects in the house were his and which were provisional. He called his father Wah, which Walter appeared to find incredibly satisfying, and his mother Ma, which Nellie also found satisfying, though she was less public about it. The summer of 1889 was warm and well-watered and productive, and by autumn the Harper McCrae operation was genuinely thriving. 12 head of cattle, a full kitchen garden, a grain field that had yielded well, and the cooperative arrangement that reduced their supply costs and gave them market access they would not have had alone. Walter bought 4 more acres from Clement Baird's estate. Baird had died in July of 1888, and his Fort Worth heirs had been systematically selling the double-bar C's Texas holdings, bringing their combined property to just over 30 acres, which was enough for what they were doing and potentially expandable. On the evening of their second wedding anniversary in November 1889, they sat on the same porch where he had asked her to marry him 2 years before. Thomas was asleep inside. The November sky was the black and brilliant version, cold, clear, crowded with stars. "Do you regret it?" he said. She looked at him. "Regret what specifically?" "Staying through the drought, all of it." He looked at the sky. "You could have sold to Doyle and gone somewhere easier." "Easier than what?" she said. "Easier than this." She gestured at the house behind her, at the well, at the dark land that she could not see but could feel the way you feel a presence in a room. "You know what I mean." "I know what you mean," she said. "And no, I do not regret it, not any part of it." She looked at him. "Not the drought and not the digging and not Doyle and not the 8 months of being alone, and especially not any of what came after." "What came after?" he repeated. "You," she said. "Thomas, the cooperative, all of it. It is mine and I built it and I would not trade any piece of it." She paused. "Not even the worst parts, because the worst parts are what proved to me that I could hold this." He was quiet for a moment. "I told Agnes Pryor again last week," he said, "when she asked me about the drought and what you had done. I told her again what I had been telling people since October of 1887. "What did you tell her?" "That you are the bravest person on the whole plain," he said. She felt the same thing she had felt the first time he said it, that complicated, resistant, moved feeling. "I told you that is not accurate," she said. "I told you I disagreed," he said. "I still disagree." She looked at the stars. "I was afraid," she said. "I have told you this." "I know you were afraid," he said. "I was there for some of it. I saw your face the morning we found the first water, and I know what it looked like: relief, yes, but also the unwinding of a fear that had been very tight. You were afraid the whole time, and you stayed anyway, and you found water, and you held the land, and you built a cooperative that is protecting people from the kind of predatory buying that almost took your land. And you did all of this in a drought year when every reasonable argument in the world pointed toward leaving." He turned and looked at her directly. "That is brave, Nellie. That is exactly what brave is." She did not have an answer to that either. It sat on her differently now than it had the first time, not as a challenge to resist, but as something she was gradually learning to receive. She was not there yet. She was not sure she would ever be fully there. She suspected she would always have one part of herself that pushed back against the word, that insisted on the role of luck and circumstance and stubbornness. But she was learning to let the other part, the part that had worked for 18 hours and dug 22 feet into cracked earth and stayed when everyone left, she was learning to let that part hear the word too. She took his hand in the November dark. "You are not bad yourself," she said. He smiled. She could feel it rather than see it. "High praise," he said. "Coming from me," she said. "Yes," he laughed. She laughed too. And the stars were the enormous Panhandle stars, and the land was dark and present all around them, and inside the house their son was sleeping deeply and dreaming whatever dreams a 10-month-old has, and everything was solid and real and earned. In the spring of 1890, two things happened. The first was that Nellie discovered she was pregnant again, which she told Walter at the kitchen table with the same directness as the first time, and he went through the same sequence of stillness, and looking at his hands, and looking at the window, and coming around the table that he had the first time, and she found that she did not mind the repetition at all. The second was that a letter arrived from New Mexico from Walter McCrae, who wrote to say that he had expanded his cattle operation and was doing well, and that the legal challenge against Cassidy had been resolved fully in his favor, and that Cassidy himself was now facing multiple legal challenges from other landowners he had attempted to squeeze out. He also wrote to say that he had met a woman named Rosa, a daughter of one of his neighboring families, and that he was hoping very much to bring her to Texas for a visit in the summer, and that he wanted his brother to meet her because he was planning to propose, and the only person in the world whose opinion he wanted before he did it was Walter. Walter read this letter twice and then passed it to Nellie, and she read it and said, "I like him already." "Owen, you have not met him." "Anyone who says that about his brother," she said, "I like." Owen and Rosa came in August. Owen was shorter and louder than Walter, with the same honest eyes and a more animated face, and he arrived with a considerable amount of energy and very strong opinions about everything that he expressed freely and without any of Walter's economy. Rosa was quiet in the particular way of people who are watching carefully and deciding what they think before they speak, and she and Nellie recognized something in each other within the first hour that the men in the room probably could not have named precisely, but could observe operating. They spent a week. Owen looked at the cooperative structure with visible excitement and asked 23 questions and told Walter that he wanted to start something similar in Doña Ana County. Rosa helped Nellie in the kitchen, and they talked about growing seasons and about the specific challenges of farming land that men with money had decided they wanted. And Rosa's family had been on their land for 4 generations going back to the Spanish land grants, and she knew the shape of that particular fight more intimately than almost anyone. On the evening before Owen and Rosa left, Walter and Owen sat on the porch for a long time after dinner, while Nellie and Rosa sat at the kitchen table with Thomas between them, being very opinionated about a wooden horse, and Nellie could hear through the window the low cadence of the two brothers talking without being able to make out the words, which seemed right. Some conversations belonged to their own space. Owen proposed to Rosa 3 months later in a letter that arrived in November announcing the engagement. Nellie wrote back the same day with a letter of genuine and direct congratulations that ran to 4 pages, because once she started, she had a great deal to say. Their second child was born in January of 1891, a girl this time, smaller and more immediately serene than Thomas had been, with her mother's coloring and a particular focused expression that Nellie recognized from her own mirror. "Ruth," Nellie said, the morning after the birth, in the same clear way she stated everything. Walter was sitting on the edge of the bed with his eyes slightly red from a second sleepless night, and the expression he wore when his feelings were extremely large and he was managing them carefully. He looked at the baby and said, "Yes, Ruth." "Ruth Marie McCrae," Nellie said. Marie for Walter's mother, who had died when he was young and whom he spoke of rarely but with great tenderness. He looked at her. "Thank you," he said. "Thank her," Nellie said. "She is the one who did all the work." This was, all things considered, a perfectly Nellie Harper thing to say, and he smiled at her in that private way that belonged to their kitchen and their bedroom and no one else, and she smiled back, and Ruth Marie McCrae slept between them and was unconcerned about any of it. The years that followed were full. Thomas started school in Cartwright in 1893, attending the county school that had been improved considerably through the efforts of several cooperative member families who had pressured the county commissioners, with Walter representing them, to allocate proper funding. He was a thoughtful student and a fierce reader, and had developed a particular interest in water systems and geology that his father considered inevitable and entirely rational. Ruth was a talker, which was the single most ironic development in the history of the Harper McCrae family, given the communicative styles of her parents, and she approached the world with an openness and a gregariousness that was entirely her own, and that her parents watched with a mixture of delight and something like respectful bafflement. Nellie had a third child in 1894, another boy, whom they named James, and who arrived in April with much less drama than the previous 2, and immediately established himself as the most amiable of the McCrae children, which, considering the baseline of determined stubbornness provided by his older siblings, was an extremely amiable disposition indeed. The cooperative grew. By 1895, it had 41 member families and had negotiated its first truly significant market contract, a supply agreement with a railroad-adjacent grain purchasing operation in Amarillo that gave the member farmers a stable price floor for their grain, rather than the volatile spot prices they had been subject to before. Walter was now formally the cooperative's legal representative to the county government, and unofficially its most trusted voice in any dispute. Nellie ran the membership committee and the resource-sharing program and was, by general consensus that she refused to acknowledge as such, the person who held the whole enterprise together. Eleanor Voss had moved from Amarillo to Cartwright in 1893, having accumulated enough legal work from the cooperative and other clients in the area to justify the move, and she had set up an unofficial practice operating through a licensed attorney in town. The legal restrictions on women practicing independently had not changed, which remained a source of deep frustration, but the arrangement worked, and Eleanor was effective and valued. Maria Domings had become the cooperative's expert on soil management and water conservation, and she had written a series of practical pamphlets on panhandle farming techniques that had been copied and distributed throughout the county and beyond, and which people in Amarillo and beyond were using. She had also, in 1893, married Samuel Pryor, which Agnes Pryor considered the greatest personal achievement of her life, and which Nellie privately agreed had been something Agnes Pryor had been engineering since at least 1890. On a September evening in 1895, Walter came home from a county meeting later than expected and found Nellie on the porch with a lamp and a book, which was where she was every evening when the weather permitted, and the children were in bed. He came up the porch steps and sat on the bench, which had been replaced twice since the original fence-board version of 1887, but occupied the same spot, and he looked at the dark land around them. "Franklin Greer is not going to run again," he said. "He announced it tonight." Franklin Greer, the county commissioner. "Is that unexpected?" Nellie said. "Not entirely. He has been feeling the pressure from the cooperative for 3 years. Walter paused. "Several people at the meeting tonight suggested I should run for the seat." Nellie put her book down. She looked at him. "What do you think?" she said. "I think I would rather be here than in county meetings 3 times a week," he said honestly. "But I think someone needs to be in that seat who is not in someone's pocket and who understands what the actual farming families of this county need." "Those are not the same consideration," she said. "No," he said. "You asked me what I think," she said. "I think you would be a good commissioner. I think the county needs someone like you in that role more than it needs to be convenient for you. And I think," she paused, "I think you know all of that already. The question is whether you are asking me for my opinion or for my permission." He looked at her, that steady, honest look. "You would need to take on more of the cooperative management," he said, "and more of the farm management through the campaign period." "I'm not unfamiliar with managing things," she said. A smile moved through his face. "No," he said, "you are not." "Then run," she said. He ran. He won in November of 1895 by a margin that surprised the Cartwright newspaper and did not surprise Nellie or Agnes Pryor. Commissioner Walter McCrae turned out to be, as his wife had predicted, genuinely good at the job, methodical and fair, and resistant to pressure in ways that the county had not always experienced in its commissioners. He pushed through improvements to the county road that connected the farming communities to Cartwright, which was a practical matter of getting product to market efficiently. He represented the farming families in a dispute with a railroad spur company that wanted to alter its rate structure in a way that would have disadvantaged small producers, and he won a partial concession that saved the cooperative members real money. He was also, for the record, absolutely committed to coming home every night, which some people found surprising in a county official and which Nellie found entirely as expected. The job was important. So was the porch, the kitchen table, the supper hour, the children's noise and questions and particular forms of chaos. He did not confuse important things with more important things. James, at 4, had become devoted to cattle in a way that suggested he had a plan for the operation that he had not fully shared yet. Thomas, at 6, was writing long, involved letters to agricultural journals asking questions about soil composition. Ruth, at 5, was in command of every social situation she entered, and had already organized 2 separate neighborhood children's games that she ran with an efficiency that Agnes Pryor found unsettlingly familiar. On an October evening in 1895, on the anniversary of his first return from New Mexico, the anniversary of the first time she had seen him coming down the road in the golden light, and her whole chest had done the thing it continued to do every time, Nellie stood at the kitchen stove and heard his horse and looked up through the window. He came down the road in the October light with his hat pushed back exactly as he always had. The light was the same golden October light. The road was the same road. The land around it was green now, well-watered, productive, entirely different from the burnt pale land of 1887, but the same land underneath. He tied his horse at the post that Thomas had helped him rebuild this spring. He came through the gate that James had learned to open and close obsessively, and now managed with considerable pride. He came up the porch steps past the bench that was the 3rd version of the bench she had built from 2 boards and a pair of fence posts, because she saw no reason to change a design that worked. He opened the door and came into the kitchen, and there was the smell of supper and the sound of the children somewhere in the back of the house and the particular quality of light that came through the west window in the evening. "Good meeting," she said. "Productive," he said, and hung his hat on the peg beside the door. "The road extension was approved. Full budget. "About time," she said. He came to the stove and stood beside her and looked at what she was making, and she handed him the spoon without being asked, and he stirred while she took down plates. Thomas appeared in the kitchen doorway with a letter in his hand. "Papa, this came today from the Amarillo University Agriculture Program. They are offering a summer learning program." Walter looked at the letter and then at his son. "Do you want to go?" Thomas considered this with the seriousness that characterized everything he did. "Yes," he said. "Then we will figure it out," Walter said. Thomas disappeared back down the hall. Ruth appeared immediately after as though she had been waiting in the queue. "Mama, tomorrow can I come to the cooperative meeting?" "The meeting is long and mostly about grain contracts," Nellie said. "I know," Ruth said. "I want to understand how it works." Nellie looked at her daughter, 8 years old and completely, openly herself, standing in the kitchen doorway with the expression of someone who had already decided and was notifying her parents rather than asking them. "Yes," Nellie said. "Come to the meeting." Ruth disappeared. James appeared half a second later, apparently from nowhere. "There is a cow in the north pasture making a noise," he said. Walter set down the spoon. "Show me," he said. He and James went out the back door toward the pasture. Nellie stood at the stove in the evening quiet and stirred the pot, and listened to the house around her. The sound of James leading his father across the yard, with the authoritative confidence of a 5-year-old who has found a cow emergency. The sound of Thomas in his room presumably writing more letters to agricultural journals. The sound of Ruth somewhere doing something that was either reading or organizing, both of which were equally likely. She looked out the east window at the land. The October sky was beginning to darken at the edges, that deep blue turning black that meant real dark was coming. The grass was good. The wells were good. The cattle were healthy. 8 years ago she had stood at this window in August heat and looked at cracked dry land and the departing backs of her neighbors, and made the decision that had made everything else possible. Not the brave decision, as people insisted on calling it, the only decision. The one she could not have not made and still been herself. But she had learned, slowly and against her stubbornness, to let it be both things. The only decision she could make, and also a brave one. The choice that came from fear and from love and from stubbornness, and from the particular Harper McCrae combination of those qualities that their children were now inheriting and refining and making their own. The back door opened and Walter came in ahead of James, who was explaining at length and with great technical detail what the cow had been doing and why it was now doing something different. Walter met Nellie's eyes across the kitchen, and she read in them what they always said, "You, this, all of it," and she looked back at him and said the same thing. "The cow is fine," he said. "James talked her out of it." "I did not talk to the cow," James said with dignity. "I assessed the situation." "Of course," Walter said seriously. "My apologies." Nellie put the plates on the table. "Call Thomas," she said. Walter called down the hall, and Thomas came out of his room, and Ruth came from wherever she had been. And they all sat at the kitchen table. The same table Thomas Harper had built with his own hands in 1885, solid and scarred and fully itself. And Nellie served supper, and Walter poured the water from the pitcher. And the children discussed their days with the overlapping, democratic energy of children who have been raised to consider their opinions worth saying aloud. Outside, the October dark came down slowly over the Texas Panhandle. The grass moved in a light wind. The well stood over its deep water. The land was still and present and entirely what it was, hard and beautiful and full of everything that had happened on it, and everything that was still going to happen. Nellie Harper McCrae looked at her table, at her husband's face in the lamplight, at her children's faces, at her father's wood under her hands, and felt the deep, specific, built and earned contentment of someone who had stayed. She had stayed when the drought hit and the neighbors left and the land cracked open and the sky burned its terrible orange. She had stayed when a speculator came with money and legal threats and condescension. She had stayed when everything reasonable pointed at leaving. She had stayed because it was her land and her parents' graves and her own stubborn heart, and she had been afraid every single day and had stayed anyway. and everything that mattered to her in the world, the man across the table, the children arguing over the last biscuit, the house around them, the cooperative that protected 41 families, the water that had never really left, all of it was because she had stayed. Walter looked up from the table and found her eyes across the supper dishes and the children's noise. He looked at her with those honest brown eyes that she knew as well as she knew her own land, and she looked back at him with everything she was, and he smiled. "Good supper," he said. "I know," she said. He laughed. She smiled. Ruth stole Thomas's biscuit in the instant they were both distracted. James observed this with the professional interest of someone collecting information. Thomas protested loudly. Normal life, full and loud and utterly, absolutely, completely worth every hard mile of the road that had brought them here. Outside, the October stars came out over the Texas Panhandle. The enormous, uncountable, brilliantly indifferent stars that had been there before any of them and would be there long after, looking down on the grass and the wells and the roads and the small lit windows of the houses where people had chosen to stay, where people had chosen each other, where the land and the love and the life were all, finally and completely, one whole thing.